Today let's learn about the life of this early milk company on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. To begin this story, we're going to need a little bit of background in milk. Up until the 1800s, milk wasn't really a household staple. Butter and cheese were, but milk spoiled too quickly to really be a useful household staple. So when milk started to become more popular in the mid to later 1800s, there were some learning curves that needed addressing. We found out that if the cow was diseased, the milk was diseased. And in the 1850s through the 1890s, people were actually getting really outraged that the farmers were knowingly selling diseased milk. There were cases of milk being a bluish color due to certain diseases, to which farmers would try to hide it by adding chalk or whatever they could find to make the milk appear normal. After thousands of children died from milk-borne illnesses like tuberculosis, otherwise known as consumption, and typhoid fever, the townspeople were speaking out that there needs to be some accountability, and they were ticked off that the government wasn't interceding. I found so many newspaper articles about this topic. This one says, we should have stringent laws controlling dairy farms, and milk cows should regularly be inspected for traces of disease. This one says, I'm convinced that the greatest cause of disease among infants in New York arises from the use of diseased milk. Around the 1860s, one guy named Louis Pasteur came up with a process of killing bacteria, which involved heating the milk at high temperatures for a short period of time. The process was called pasteurization, but some argued that pasteurizing milk lost its nutritional qualities. Fairfield Dairy now enters the story. They argued that milk can be safe and nutritious, and it started to make milk popular again. So let's talk about Charles Bowman. He was born in 1891 in Maryland. His dad was a farmer, and when Charles was 13, he convinced his dad to buy a dairy farm. Charles graduated from Maryland Agriculture College, and then he went on to learn chemistry at the Baltimore City Health Department. He was learning about bacteriology and working in milk regulation, so he knew what he wanted to do at an early age. In 1912, at age 21, he started his business, working from his dad's dairy farm, which he eventually called Fairfield Farm, using the two families' cows and the two family horses, pulling the only wagon that he had. His very first day, he sold 5 pints of milk. And how cute is this Fairfield Dairy milkman toy? Baltimore City Council was already making new milk regulations, and some of the dairy farmers were not happy about the new regulations and tried to oppose them. Charles Bowman helped persuade the dairy farmers to comply. Here's a 1915 directory. He's listed as proprietor of Fairfield Dairy. In 1920, he's 29 now, and he has a wife and 3 small children. Here's a photo of his dairy business in the early 1900s. It looks like a pretty big operation for how long they've been in business. In 1925, the business had grown so much that he was offered $1.5 million for the company, and he refused it. In the city directories up to 1927, the business is listed as Fairfield Farms Dairy. And here's a few photos of his milk bottles. In 1928, he's been in business for about 16 years now. Bowman bought the Western Maryland Dairy, and the two companies were merged to be named Fairfield Western Maryland Dairy Company. At the time, Western Maryland was producing about 54% of the area's milk, and here's some of those bottles. And Fairfield had been producing about 38%. The merged companies were now producing about 50,000 gallons of milk a day. The following year, in 1929, we see the name reflected in the directory as Fairfield Western Maryland Dairy Company. I dare you to say that 5 times fast. Here's an article talking about some improvements being made by the Fairfield Western Maryland Dairy, owners of the East Berlin milk plant. So I guess they absorbed a few other companies as well. Charles Bowman was described as easygoing. He didn't like to talk about his career, and when he did, he was quoted saying, "This was something I sorta wanted to do and kinda thought it would work out well." He was very tall, quiet-mannered, and would often wander from department to department to talk to the fellas, as he would call them. He assumed that every man was good for something if the proper place had been found for him. So he wouldn't lay off or fire any of the fellas as long as he could find a useful place for him. There was a company baseball team called the Fellows, and Charles Bowman played on it for several years. It says, until the 9 best players got too good for him. But he always enjoyed baseball. He was known for taking really good care of his horses, getting custom harnesses and wagons made by local artisans. He was also the director of the National Dairy Products Company. It was an international holding company which had assets in excess of $200 million, which also absorbed the Fairfield Western Maryland Company in 1930. In 1930, we see this ad for this new improvement to their milk bottles. Now Fairfield Western Maryland Dairy tops off its service with a lift right cap, the easiest cap in the world to remove. No more hunting for an opener, no more splashing the rich top cream. This little patented groove makes it easy to raise. And here's a 1931 ad for buttermilk, for beauty's sake, claiming that buttermilk aids in digestion and also clears the skin. Still trying to make sure that the public knows that they're always working on safety, they would occasionally put an ad in the paper letting everyone know that there are chemists and bacteriologists on hand always, making sure everything is safe. We see from this 1932 article that George Jackson is vice president of the firm. In 1933, an investigation of the Baltimore and Washington milk situation had been investigated by the Senate District Committee. Now, there was a lot of commotion going on that I really didn't dig into, but lots of organizations are involved and there's discussions about milk prices. Well, Charles Bowman ended up getting sick, and a hearing had to be postponed due to his illness. He was later hospitalized for peritonitis, which is abdominal pain and probable infection. He wanted to hurry up and get out of there so that he could go testify during this investigation. He says, "I don't want them to think I'm trying to dodge them." Well, he had an operation, but he ended up dying in the hospital at age 42, leaving 3 teenage kids and a young wife. His obituary was huge. So George Jackson, who was vice president, is now president of the company. He represented the company at the hearing later in 1933. Here's another ad in 1934 to remind the public all that the company is doing to ensure safety. We're in the middle of the Great Depression and milk prices are a really big concern right now. Also, during the 30s, radio programs were very popular. Remember, this is before television, so the family would sit around the radio and listen to all types of programs. One program was being sponsored by Fairfield Dairy, and this particular day, Dr. Rura was going to be speaking to mothers about children's health, habits, and diseases. Here's another safety ad in 1934. In 1935, a new bottle enclosure called Seal Test is being rolled out. It's a better seal than ever before. Then, suddenly in 1935, George Jackson, the president of the company, dies suddenly of a heart attack. He was 68. After Jackson died, a guy named Thomas Carnes was president. And soon after this, we start seeing some property getting sold off. Also, some horses are being sold off. But by then, automobiles had replaced the need for horses. Here's a photo from around the 40s of the Fairfield dairy plant. Newspapers ran until about 1940, and they're listed in the directory until 1942. Then Ancestry doesn't have directories for the years between 1942 and 1955, and it's not listed in 1955. So I can't tell you exactly what year the company ends. Most sources think it's sometime in the 40s though. Here in 1968, some more Fairfield land is being sold off. Here's a 1976 article in the paper and it's titled, "Miss You in the Morning, Mr. Milkman." I thought it was interesting since I didn't live during these times. It says, today you buy milk in paper cartons at the supermarket, but until 1930 you could live anywhere and your milk was delivered 7 days a week by horse and wagon, a memorable ritual that became part of your life. Toward dawn, you could hear the clinking of the bottles as the milkman set out your order on your porch or steps, according to the note that had been left out for him the previous night. Even earlier, you would hear the milkman's horse clop-clopping, moving along the deserted street the distance of a few houses, then stopping. The more you worked with those horses, the more you respected their intelligence. said Frank Drager, who used to work for Fairfield, Western Maryland Dairy. It goes on to say that to reduce the early morning noise, horses were fitted with rubber horseshoes, and the wagons used balloon tires. By 1939, all the horses and wagons were gone, and trucks were used. A whole generation has grown up without ever seeing the note set out on the porch at night, without hearing the clinking of the bottles or the clop-clop of the horses. It's just a shame, says Frank Drager. With all that stopping and starting, the horse and wagon was much more efficient than the truck at milk delivery. But that's progress for you, he says. Apparently, Fairfield became known as Seal Test. So maybe it was a merger? I don't know. So I found Thomas Carnes' obituary to see if I can find any more clues. It says, from 1934 to 1940 he lived in Baltimore and headed the local dairy. Then he became president of the National Dairy Products Corporation in New York, the parent firm of the Baltimore Dairy. He retired in 1948 and then worked as an accountant for several companies. Today, the Fairfield properties have long been sold off, and this might be a remnant of one of the buildings. It was used for a haunted house for several years, but it's probably getting knocked down soon. So I've got a 1-pint milk bottle. I'm not sure if there's anything on it to date it, but it says Fairfield Western Maryland Dairy on it, so that would date it after the merger, which would have been 1928 to about 1942. The back also has a triangle saying Health Department permit and has a 1 inside. It also says 1 pint. There's a WM and a 7 at the bottom. And there's also some numbers here, possibly this 30 might be the date. And here's a few recipe books from probably the 1930s. And that's it for today, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.